How many times did Jesus cleanse the temple? Once or twice? On the screen is now seen two of the four Gospel accounts which describe what happened in the temple. Please use the pause button as required. A brief, important introductory remark. Jesus' actions and purification of the Temple of Jerusalem, traditionally called the cleansing of the temple, was, it is proposed, the principal event in the life and ministry of Jesus, and was inseparable from the ultimate cleansing of the temple he achieved on Mount Calvary. For on Mount Calvary, the building in Jerusalem was transformed into his body, where we, the members of his body, and the living stones in the new temple, are cleansed from sin. The purpose, however, of this video is simply to consider the question, how many times did Jesus cleanse the temple, once or twice, and how important is such a question for an appreciation of the life and ministry of Jesus? It is proposed that Jesus cleansed the temple not only once, but on two separate occasions, the first at the beginning and the second at the end of his 3 years of public ministry. The main evidence in support of this position is found in A. certain important details recorded in the Gospel accounts describing the cleansing of the temple, and B. the writings of several of the early church fathers, including St. Augustine, St. John Chrysostom, and St. Theophilus of Antioch. That there were two distinct occasions when Jesus cleansed the temple is a very important fact to establish, for it means that the entire ministry of Jesus, from the very beginning to the end, appears to be linked to what was going on in the temple and to what he was longing to bring about in the sanctuary of Jerusalem, which he referred to as his Father's house. It will further be proposed that sandwiched between these two cleansings of the temple are several important dialogues and events described in the Gospels during the life and ministry of Jesus that relate to his actions in the holy place. Following this perspective, it will be seen that the two cleansings of the temple were not just two isolated events in the life of Jesus that were unrelated to one another, but rather events that shaped and determined his ministry as a whole, so much so that the Gospels might most profitably be read from the viewpoint of his actions in the holy place under the title The Four Gospels in Light of the Cleansing of the Temple, or Jesus' Whole Life and Ministry in Light of His Actions in the Temple. In another video entitled The Cleansing of the Temple Throughout the Public Ministry of Jesus, these events and dialogues will be separately examined, especially those relating to the significance of the temple as his Father's house and to the wedding feast that Jesus was about to celebrate there, which Jesus significantly addressed just after he cleansed the temple at the end of his ministry in Holy Week. Please use the pause button to read the additional note. Here, however, our attention is simply devoted to the question, did Jesus cleanse the temple once or twice? Let us look at the evidence in favour of the two cleansing interpretation proposed. First is the internal evidence found within the various Gospel accounts describing the cleansing of the temple. 3 points are noted. 1. The Gospel of St. John records Jesus' cleansing of the temple immediately after Jesus' first miracle, when he changed the water into wine at the wedding feast of Cana at the very beginning of his 3 years of public ministry. The evangelist, St. John, clearly links the two events together, for he writes in verse 12 that it was after this, that is, after the wedding in Cana, that Jesus went to Capernaum, where he stayed there only a few days. Then in the next verse, verse 13, St. John writes, just before the Jewish Passover, Jesus went up to Jerusalem. This is the first of the 3 Passovers described in his Gospel. It was at this Passover, the first in St. John's Gospel, and at the beginning of his 3 years of public ministry, when Jesus therefore cleansed the temple. 2. In the same Gospel account of St. John, the Jewish people in the temple on that day, we are told, make a significant statement to Jesus which indicates the very year in which this cleansing event took place. They said to Jesus, "This temple has been under construction for 46 years, and will you raise it up in 3 days?" Scholars noting that Herod the Great began his reconstruction of the temple in 19 or 20 BC, and adding the 46 years which had elapsed, compute this cleansing event recorded in St. John's Gospel in the year of 27 or 28 AD, that is, 3 years before the events of Holy Week, beginning with the triumphal entry of Jesus into Jerusalem, followed by another, that is, the second cleansing of the temple, leading subsequently to his death and resurrection. A comment on the reference to 46 years from the Jerome Biblical Commentary. Please use the pause button. 3. Scholars have noted several different details recorded in the account of the cleansing of the temple by St. John, with that recorded by the 3 synoptic evangelists, St. Matthew, St. Mark and St. Luke. They conclude that the synoptic evangelists record a different event, that which took place at the end of Jesus' ministry, or what is commonly referred to as the second cleansing of the temple. One obvious difference noted is the charge made by Jesus at the first cleansing of the temple, when Jesus described his Father's house as having been turned into a house of trade, a charge which several of the early church fathers wrote was elevated by Jesus at the second cleansing to being a den of robbers. The second evidence in support of the 2 cleansing interpretation is found in the writings of the early church fathers, among whom will be referenced are St. Augustine, St. John Chrysostom, and St. Theophilus of Antioch. Their writings will each be displayed in turn upon the screen, with the relevant parts highlighted. Please use the pause button as required. The renowned saint and scholar of the Church in the 13th century, St. Thomas Aquinas, who studied intensely the writings of the early Church, also believed that there were 2 different times when Jesus cleansed the temple. On the screen is now seen a relevant passage in this regard, taken from his commentary on St. John's Gospel. Please use the pause button as required.